and welcome. This is Debbie from Lime Digital Design, and thank you for joining me for Doodling with Debbie. I seem to be deep into a mixed media phase at the moment, and the simple heat embossing on this card made for an easy masculine mixed media card full of interest and texture. I concentrated on two supplies, the hand-lettered Friends cling stamp set and the Friend Greetings clear stamp set. As always, all products used in my card today are listed and linked below for your convenience. I wanted to heat emboss the hand-lettered Friends set for some easy heat emboss resist with watercolours. With this in mind, I chose Archer's Hot Press Watercolour card. As a watercolour card, it will handle the water media aspect, and being hot pressed, it has a smooth texture, which is great for embossing on. I placed a piece of the card in the misty and treated it with anti-static powder. I have this powder left over from an anti-static tool where the brush wore away. There was still powder left though, and not wanting to waste any good supplies, I simply keep the leftover powder in a jar with a Ranger Perfect Pearls brush. This brush is so nice and soft to sweep the powder all over the card. I lined up the hand-lettered Friends set and inked with Versamark ink before stamping onto the card and pressing down with a good rub over with one of my painting cloths. I sprinkled white embossing powder over the top and then heat set until the powder melted and became smooth and glossy. And it is that glossy surface which will resist the watercolours I add over the top shortly. Before then though, I made sure to tape the card securely to a board. I plan on using lots of watery layers, and taping to the board prevents the card from warping. I love mucky, muted colours, and so I mixed up some dusky blues and greens using Daniel Smith watercolours. Use whatever water media you have to hand though. This loose and easy technique doesn't require quality paints, and you can use anything from your stash. There are two ways you can heat emboss with watercolours, and I will be using both today. This first technique watercolours over a heat emboss design, in this case the hand-lettered background. The watery paint pools in and around the letters as the slick surface of the embossing resists the paint, and it slides off and creates lovely puddles around the words. I started with a pale watery mix and then added some concentrated paint in areas. I was aiming for a background with lots of variation in colour and depth, with areas of definition coming and going. I added a little grey-brown in places to ground the colours and then dried off with a heat tool. Before I started on another layer of paint, I used a brush with clean clear water and my painting cloth to rub over some of the words to clean up any remnants of paint which hadn't been resisted by the heat embossing. At any point you can do this to ensure that the letters are as clean as you like. Personally, I like where things get hidden in places and then become evident in others. I added a second layer of paint and this time made sure the mixtures were deeper in colour by using a mix with more paint to water than I had in the first layer. I also added some white gouache in places into this layer. Gouache is an opaque watercolour and the white gave a misty, hazy look in places. I dried the panel and then switched to a smaller brush to add white gouache and leftover paint splatter. I also added a good splatter of water over the top, and as the gouache and paint are still wet, then you get lovely little puddles amongst areas of splatter. I dried this layer off, and I do count splatter as a third layer, one again which adds and creates interest. When dry, I added a final layer of splatter and this time left the splatter without water to dry more distinct. Moving on, and here's a second technique on how you can heat emboss with watercolour. Rather than adding the watercolour over the heat embossing, you can add heat embossing over the top of watercoloured piece. This gives the heat embossing a much cleaner, clear definition and is great for sentiments. I added a few layers of colour and water splatter. I didn't want paint and gouache splatter though, because this might make the words harder to read. I'll come back to this piece in a moment, but first I dried everything off and then pulled back the painter's tape. The best way to do this is to pull the tape right back on itself at an angle, and this 3M painter's tape is great, and I very rarely have trouble with the tape pulling at the paper. I had a quick clean up of lettering, this time with a baby wipe, which I then used to clean up my work surface. I trimmed the panel down to be just smaller than an A2 card front. This leaves me with the main background for the card, the watercoloured piece for the sentiment, and a leftover piece which I will save for another day. I save all my scraps and love when I can add them to other projects. Onto the sentiment, and this uses the Friends greeting set and the watercolour piece from earlier. I placed the watercolour piece in the Misty and treated with anti-static powder. Then using Versamark ink, I stamped a sentiment from the Friend greeting set before sprinkling with white embossing powder and heat setting. My preferred way to trim out sentiments is to use a craft knife and a metal edge clear ruler on a cutting mat. I find I have more control of the dimensions this way and use the grid of the ruler to ensure my cuts are straight. If I'd placed this greeting straight onto the main watercolour piece, it would get lost as the colours are the same. And so to make the sentiment stand out, I backed it with ivory card. Before I added the sentiment to the card front though, I wanted to add more texture with my favourite crackle paste from Tim Holtz. Using a spatula, I smeared the paste over the top left and bottom right. Now, normally I would allow the paste to dry naturally, but seeing as we were on video, I used my heat tool to dry the paste quickly. I then used the edge of the spatula to rough up the paste some more, and then to emphasise the crazy crackle texture, I rubbed crooked broomstick and then walnut stained distress crayons over the top. I used my finger to rub the crayons into the cracks, and then dabbed on some water to loosen the crayon before blotting up the excess. To help the crackle blend with the background, I added a layer of watercolour and some loose splatter in leftover paint and white gouache. You can see here how fun that texture is and how with all the layers of paint, splatter and crackle paste, the lettering of the background supports the theme of the sentiment but in a subtle way as the words come and go under the layers. For a more masculine finish to the card, I stapled the sentiment to the card front and added a piece of foam tape on the far end to lift it off the background a little. I added more foam tape to the back of the panel and adhered it to the card base. To finish off, I decided, as I was aiming for a masculine vibe, that maybe my usual sequins and pearls was not a great option. Instead, I went with a few Nuvo droplets in duck-egg blue, dark walnut and pale gold. When I add embellishments, I keep in mind the design rule that says things in triangles and odd numbers are attractive to the eye. So I added the droplets in 3 places to create a visual triangle around the sentiment, and within each area used a droplet of each of the 3 colours. And so there you go, a simple heat embossed background as a base for this mixed media card with a grungy masculine feel. On the Simon Says Stamp blog you will find a coordinating blog post with more details of this card. If you want to find me, I blog over at limedigitaldesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me and I'll see you next time.